Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this restart, in a sense, of the BDA EdCon proceedings. I know that many of you were in the Watson demonstration and workshop earlier on, so welcome back to the things. And the session is now being run by Kathy, who's down there. She'll be working from the floor, and then we have three of us up here talking about, or answering questions, posing questions about curricula which transcend single institutions and across the world, transnational education. And there's some very interesting questions that are coming up as we try and meet some requirements to help other parts of the world. And Kathy will introduce it properly. Yep. Just one other little point. I've managed to upload most of the presentations from yesterday, and the presentations for today are already there. And we'll be putting up as many of the workshop presentations that go with the workshop as well. And I've just agreed with Dennis that we'll have the data files available on the conference website as soon as we can. It might not be today or tomorrow, but it just depends. But we're going to build more and more resources into this website that you can use and share and to promote things. So thanks very much. Over to Kathy.
Good morning, everyone. I notice you're very much like high school. Yeah, so I've got most at the back, and so you're going to join in with this panel event. So if you think unicorns are rare, unicorn makers are rarer. And sharing best practice and the skills that, well, you're teaching now is a requirement of the UN, because globally there is a huge shortage of skills. So, can I start by asking how many of you have developed a curriculum which is taught in another country by another tutor, and you also present the same course in your home country? So who's already developing a curriculum which is presented in another country? Can you put your hand up? Right, now watch everybody. These are your experts. Grab their cards now, because if you're not doing it now, you will be, because this shortage is major. So they're the people, there's your experts. Plus, if you notice, our panel. So there's many political reasons why we're being asked to develop transnational curriculum, but it comes with a few issues. And I'll be asking the panel some questions, and probably some of you as well. So, can I start with my first question to the panel? What experience, one at a time please, what experience do you have in creating big data curriculum that's presented across national borders? So, who would like to start? Jose in the middle.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jose Luis Guerrero from Georgetown University Business School. So I'm going to talk about the aspects of business education of big data. My experience, the most direct experience that I have, is creating big data curriculum in France. As you know very well, when we look at the need in different countries, one of the things that I noticed that in which way big data is observed in the United States, especially, and in France would be quite different. Well, first of all, the French don't really call big data. They have to have the French translation, and the French translation of big data is data mass. So in this particular case, if you see, they are talking about the massive information that you may have. And sometimes when I look at examples of the US with respect to big data, the simple example that I see is the census. When they look at the 10 questions, 10 minutes per person in the US, and you have the 10 questions, and they look at that and they're quite surprised of some of the questions that we ask in the US, especially question number 8 and question number 9, in which question number 9 asks, which race are you? And question number 8, are you Hispanic or not? All those questions, in many ways, from the French point of view, is unthinkable. I mean, they have other questions from the French point of view that will be considered impossible. So I remember last year in March, I have to give a talk on big data to a group of students and professors, and the question that they ask me all the time is, in which way could we preserve the privacy of the people when we ask those questions. And sometimes there's a resistance, even with the MBA. I think the resistance is naive because all the multinational, French multinational, have to gather data in order to do that. But there is a denial. So I want to make the difference between business application for the MBAs, but also when we look at France, engineering schools, some other schools, the idea is totally different. So with the curriculum, one of the elements that I emphasize in Latin Europe is in which way the information that I gathered could be used or not in order to get to know our customers better. Everybody wants to sell products in many ways. Now, this is my expression in France. When I go to Latin America, next week I have to give a talk about big data and government in Colombia, and one of the elements there is, what is big data, in which way the citizen could be benefited? So there are elements of privacy, there's elements of organization, and it's very difficult when you want to design a curriculum to say, especially in some countries, if the information that we gather is real information. Sometimes in some countries we trust the veracity of the information, but other people have a lot of difficulties in understanding that the data that they get is really the data. So the approach, the academic approach with the curriculum has to be realistic depending upon the country you're going through. Bringing stories or histories from some countries in which we used it sometimes may not be as informative as we want it to be. I could continue.
Richard?
Yeah. In terms of transnational big data or analytics, we're just starting to run one of our programs as a final year top-up in Bangladesh. So we haven't got much current experience about transnational analytics, but I do have something like 10 to 15 years of teaching in Southern Africa, face-to-face, programs which in different countries, in Malawi, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe specifically, and other modules which we've taught in the UK and in Greece. And it really comes down to the pedagogic approach that you take. We can, if one is designing your programs to with very, very tightly specified objectives, your teaching material has pre-specified case studies or sets of data, then yes, you begin to have problems in terms of moving those programs out into other countries. What we've been doing in Derby, because Derby University's had partnership programs across the world for 15, 20 years. And so we've learnt that it's much better that where you want to use case study sort of thing, so in analytics, big data, you know, you're saying, I want some data, a set of data. And the classic academic approach is the prof creates a data set for business module or something with a few tens or hundreds of rows of data, which with great effort they put together. They don't want to move it or change it. And that may well build in cultural specificity, which may not be appropriate in other countries. And referring to what Jose just said, you know, the questions on questionnaires can be perfectly acceptable in Europe, but in Botswana, for example, and there was a wonderful example some of my students told me, they did I think it was a Finnish charity, put together a questionnaire to do with AIDS and so on. And some of the questions in that, when eventually the final form of the questionnaire arrived, and having never seen the drafts, you know, there's 100,000 copies of this questionnaire had been printed and shipped down to Botswana. And the locals said, oh, you can't ask those questions here. So, you know, there are things which are very, very, very specific culturally. And so what we're doing is very much ensuring that the way we design our teaching materials, the way we design our assignments, are inherently localized. So that if it's data that you need, well, in Derby, okay guys, I'm not going to give you data, go find it. There's open source data coming out of your ears if you go look for it. You can find something that is data that is of interest to you. It just has to meet the criterion of it's that big or bigger. And so that means then that you can go out to Malaysia or to Thailand, Bangladesh or Botswana or Malawi, wherever, or the USA or the UK, and the students will go and look for data that is something that they are interested in, that meets the criteria you need to meet in terms of the analytics. And that kind of helps a lot. So a lot of experience and learned a lot about different ways. And by the way, if you are teaching across languages, even if you're not, if you're teaching the same language, English, remember that English and American English, there are certain words which are fundamentally different. Warranty. The legal business implications of the word warranty here in the USA and in the UK are different. If you're going to an African country where their English is maybe parallel first or maybe parallel second language, you need to be very careful how you choose your words, because the words you think you're saying, they may well understand differently. And I mean, there's a lovely word. We have 3 words in English: cuddle, embrace, and hug. In Botswana, they have 1. And so they may reflect back to you. If they want you to embrace a concept, they may ask you to hug it or to cuddle it. And this is an interesting aspect of transnational education, is the language may not be heard or understand how you thought it was going to be.
Can I move on to Dennis then? Because you're going to have a really different view, I think. So your experience at this stage.
Sorry, I can barely hear you, by the way.
A bit closer.
So, but clearly this works.
Shall I repeat it, the question to you? So what experience do you have in creating big data curricula, or being involved with the creation of big data curricula that cross national boundaries?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm still having a problem hearing you. I don't know why, but
Okay.
I think I've lost my hearing when I was up here earlier.
So I'm looking at what experience do you have
Oh, what experience?
in creating curricula or being involved with the creation of curricula that cross national boundaries?
Okay, so I go back to a couple of years ago when I was I was asked to go down to the Philippines in Manila to work with the universities and colleges there in implementing big data and analytics education. And the interesting thing there is a lot of what they were looking at is trying to create or trying to make Philippines the new hub for analytics. They actually even created a consortium called Analytica Philippines, which was across, it not only included the government, okay, and the educational part of the government there, but it also included the universities right throughout the Philippines and industry. Okay, so they all started working together, and the interesting thing about the development of the program there is that, you know, analytics is huge. We all know analytics is huge. You all knew, you know, even 2.5 years ago, the biggest thing was there's a skills shortage. We can do something. We need to do something, and the Philippines was a prime area to actually have people trained in an area where they needed. There was such a shortage there is incredible, and they knew they could address it, but they needed to get every level of government, the industry, and all of the faculty engaged in it. And what we did is that the curriculum we came up with was made up of 6 courses. They covered the different areas of analytics that you would expect. We didn't really touch big data at the time, but it was more towards the side of descriptive, prescriptive, predictive analytics. There was a component in there for doing a research project, and there was also a couple of other areas in there. One of them was an introductory side with regards to data management, so they really were careful about making sure people understood how to manage data, how to work with data, before they got into the analytics side and the tools side of things. The interesting thing is that that program, those 6 courses were run the same way right across all of those universities. They were run the same way. They were all, and because of the fact not all of them were located, like this is right throughout the Philippines, so some people actually came in 3 hours, a 3-hour drive in every day to get into the training or what have you. But the same program was applied right across all of those universities and colleges. And so if it was a technical college, or if it happened to be, you had your technical colleges, you had your university-like, which is more on the theoretical side, all of them taught the same thing. But the thing is that additionally, because it was the same thing, everything was recognized. So if you finished whatever program in one school, you can go to the other. Okay, they were all feeding into each other, so it really depended, because they had to allow for the fact that people were moving back and forth, depending on depending on the situation. And after that, things started morphing a little bit more into a little bit more specific. We have our business people, we have our IT people, so we need to adjust those programs. Now, a lot of the programs that were implemented in over there part of the reason they were implemented there is the fact that many of the youth were leaving to go elsewhere to actually get that training, to actually get that education, to get that certificate program, to add to their degree. You know, they could be going off as a postgrad, but in some cases it's like, no, I'm going to go off, I'm going to be an undergrad someplace else, and then I'll come back. And a lot of, the program itself was, number one, part of it was, we want to keep our people here. We want to get them good jobs. We want to build the economy. So there was a lot at stake in the whole setup of that whole program itself. And they've extended it even more over the last couple of years. I haven't been there in in about a year or so, but they've extended it even more and expanded it out. But the interesting thing is it's the same stuff that we would actually deliver here. It's the same stuff we would deliver here. It's over there. Obviously for them, it's going to be recognized.
Can I pick up on a few of these points that you're making? Because so far what we've heard is that Jose and Richard are saying they localize their programs. But if you listen to what Dennis is saying, actually they deliver the same in the States as they do elsewhere. However, you've got a legal implication coming into this one. And so that is an interesting aspect. And do the students want to stay in their country, or do they want to move to other countries? Or is it a case of if you've developed a transnational course, you have international students in your own university who then go elsewhere? So,
just a point of clarification, Kathy. We localize in terms of the data, but in terms of the teaching material, the learning material, it is identical.
It's identical.
The assignments are identical.
I'm going to pick up on a few of these a little bit later, but those of you who haven't created transnational courses, probably just starting to get the flavour of what's actually happening between a legal, a local, a transnational. So can I ask each of you, what do you think makes a good transnational education course? And again, can I start with Jose in the middle? Yep. What makes a good course?
You know, I think when you teach internationally, I'm going to go back to Richard's comment, especially with respect to some concept of aspects of words in English. It could be different in different ways. Now, when you speak a second language or a third language, many people are convinced that when you're given the lecture, and let's say in Spanish and use English words, these English words are clearly understood. There was a PhD thesis written 3 years ago that somebody in Spain compared vocabulary of big data in 5 different languages. Was it English and Spanish and things like that, and the corresponding translation. And the answer was that those concepts were not the same, but were overlapping in many ways. So I think it's very important, if you decide in one particular way to give or to be teaching big data or any topic in a target language, you cannot be sure that the concept that we understand in English could be easily understood in other languages. And besides, from my point of view, it doesn't look appropriate. You know, if you're lecturing in French, if you're lecturing in other language or in Chinese, and you begin use this English word, two things that could be quite negative for the idea of teaching. First of all, is to assume that the people know what you're talking about, and second, their concept of big data, when it's translated to a target language, could be overlapping, could be not the same. So I think the clarity of the basic concept is extremely important in order to be able to succeed. Otherwise, we have miscommunication. We could be miscommunication in English. And also the order. I mean, it is very common that we want to gather data in the US. We ask questions that are direct. I am a statistician, so I believe in proxy questions. A proxy question is the question that you want to ask, but you don't dare to ask. The typical example, if I ask your age, you could lie, but if I ask you when did you finish high school, you may say innocently. It's exactly the same information. So to use proxy variables or proxy approach in some cultures in which personal information is not easily revealed could be a simple idea. So do not believe that the people are understanding the concept in the same way.
Richard?
I think one of the most interesting aspects of transnational education programs is the different educational cultures. And from my perspective, I picked this one up when I was working on a program we taught, a Derby program which was taught over distance by video conferencing technologies to Israel. And built upon also having a whole load of students we have regularly from India, Pakistan, Malaysia and China. Basically, our particular point in the UK education system, higher education, like here in the US predominantly, is we are interested in critical thinking, critical analysis. That's our number one thing that we get out of an undergraduate degree is you learn how to be a critical thinker and critical analysis and researcher and so on. Whereas you might say east of Israel, Lebanon, it becomes very, very much more fact. I've had students coming from Pakistan and India whose English accent is almost impenetrable to me, but they can speak English all right. And they have been trained to perfect memory. Their auditory and visual memory is staggering. They can repeat back to me verbatim in my phraseology what I said in a lecture or a seminar 2, 3, 4 weeks ago. We from the West tend to not even remember verbatim what we said 5 minutes ago. And then they are assessed on perfect recall. If they want to get a 100% for their score for their course, all they have to do in an exam is to work out which bit of brain to dump. Dunk. It could be what the prof said in the lecture. It could be the right chunk from the prof's book, which of course is his or her course material. And if they can do that perfectly, they got 100%. And of course, they don't need to provide any attribution or citations because it's the way that it works. So plagiarism that we consider with incredible opprobrium here in the West is the done thing. It is showing respect to your professor or whoever's work you are copy-pasting. So we have an issue to do with that. But what I want to see whenever I work across borders is to remove the question of perfect memory, and that causes a problem, and move it to understanding and application. And that's really one of the biggest issues working between East or West and East, I find, is perfect memory versus really good understanding and application. And so we always I do, and most of my colleagues working across borders, we work on assignments that are a context using your knowledge by applying it to solve a particular problem in context.
Okay. Did you put your hand up and said you had some experience?
Yeah.
Do you have the mic, please? What's your experience?
Well, you asked the
What makes
question,
a
have
good
we taught
course?
the same course in 2 different countries? And I've
Yep.
done that, but it was
And
not.
what
it
do you
was
think
not
makes a
big
good
data.
course?
It was actually a writing class for doctoral students.
Mm-hmm.
And I had taught it in the U.S., and I had a chance to teach a similar course in China.
Mm-hmm.
I guess since I have the microphone,
Closer.
A bit closer to your mouth.
To your mouth, please.
the surprise that I got was right before I left for China, my person who had kind of arranged this for me said that, now in the U.S., you've been sitting around in a circle and just having conversations about articles. That's not going to work. He said you need to have lectures, you need to give tests. And so I did that. And they were not prone to talk very much. So I had to have a different delivery style. I guess that was my...
A different delivery style.
Yeah,
So what makes
yeah.
a good course? The delivery style
Yeah,
needs to
exactly.
change if you're the person going out to teach it.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Can I just grab, you having a rest for a minute, Dennis? Peter, what do you think makes a good transnational education course?
I think there's got to be an understanding of the culture as well. I think that plays a big role. I've been teaching in the international circuit, high school, K-12, for the past 20 years. I've taught in Canada, Australia, Jakarta, Singapore, Malaysia, and now in Shanghai. And there, you got to bring the local culture in context as well. Take, for instance, when I was teaching in Jakarta, say if you've got the number $12.50, we would have written the $.50. The Indonesians would have written it 12,50. And I actually marked the student wrong. I said, what's the comma? Only later on, only then I realized that that's how they do it. I think it's just like the French as well, right? They put the comma instead of the decimal. So you need to take this into account. And also, when I'm teaching Asian students, like I teach in the international schools, which delivers the North American curriculum, when I can see the big difference there. If I would be teaching an Asian student in an international school, say in Malaysia or Singapore, just like what Richard said, regurgitation is what they're good at. They can paraphrase, they can give you word for word to what they have said. But a North American kid would be like, wow, you know, totally creative and everything else. But how do you grade that? Because if you grade that, you know, using the Western style, the parents will come back to you and say, look, my kid gave you back exactly what you taught him or her.
Yeah.
So you got to understand the culture as well, and it's a hard mix. Currently in Shanghai, where I'm teaching, the Chinese government are actually sending some teachers to our school to learn the Western way of teaching for them to be more creative. Now, having said that, I came across articles on DH from Australia that says that the Australians are actually looking at how the Chinese teach math. So I'm getting, you know, mixed reports. I guess it all depends on who's the one doing the research there. Like the North American right now, they're talking about the everyday math in the K-12 program. But in the Asian culture, math, you just got to know your times table. You memorize it. Calculus, step 1, step 2, step 3. You don't have to understand the question. You just have to know to be able to crank the wheel. I teach both calculus and stats as well. Very different. In calculus, wow, they can give me all the steps very, very clearly. But when it comes to stats, which is like more of a wording thing, they couldn't do it. They cannot answer the question because they cannot describe the response.
That's interesting, because we want to go on and look at the assessments. Is there anybody else, put your hands up, who had experience designing curriculum, as in what makes a good transnational curriculum? Have I got any? Oh, there we go.
Thank you. I'm not an education expert, so it's really, I think all of us sort of monitor the literature and the discussions very intensely because we are educators. So one thing that I find very fascinating that's developing in the U.S. right now is this growth mindset, right? So Dweck and I can't remember what university, but it's an education professor who has this theory that U.S. children really need to develop a growth mindset because the U.S. culture and the parents tend to focus on the fixed mindset. And they believe that the parents' math phobia is preventing their kids from learning math. So parents would say things like, I'm not good at math, or it's, what they call math anxiety. And also the assumption, basically is nature versus nurture, that the assumption is that math is genetic, right? Or whatever in general, that learning this topic is genetic. So if you're not good at it, don't even spend time working on it because it's a fixed trait. Whereas, so what they have been doing in the U.S. is promoting the growth mindset, meaning that instead of talking about, I'm not good at math, you want to focus on the effort that you put in terms of growing and developing your math skill. And parents should praise, and teachers as well, should praise the effort as opposed to whether you can get it for the first time or not. So I monitor this very closely because I find that the Chinese parents and the Chinese kids do the total opposite. The Chinese culture, the Confucius culture, is 100% growth mindset. They have never heard of fixed mindset. There's no genetic. Everybody has to work hard, right? So a lot of the learning style of the Chinese students, as well as the parents, they expect the teachers from a growth mindset perspective. They've never heard of fixed mindset. So they actually don't have this genetic or like, I'm really good at this, I'm really bad at that. That notion does not exist in the Asian culture. So I think for us to really bridge the gap, we really have to think about our assumption, right? So a lot of times when we approach our students, we come from a very Western kind of assumption of fixed mindset. So when we look at these, we never realize that these Chinese parents and students come in from a very growth mindset kind of culture.
So culture, but also the learning style is also something that we need to take into account. I know you wanted to join in.
Actually, I have a question. A lot of the things you describe, I experienced them in my classroom in upstate New York with just having international students, especially graduate students. So is there an inherent difference between teaching international students here in the US versus actually having a multinational program? Is there something different about the program elsewhere?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Because we have quite a lot of international students, both undergraduate and masters. And in one sense, I'm culturally intolerant in one sense, in that I do not want to pander to those with a rote learning perspective. I am determined that I'll maintain our European UK standards because we are giving away or awarding UK degrees. So I am determined that they will do critical thinking. That is the fundamental criterion that I apply. So from that perspective, I will apply the same approach to the overseas students who come to us as I would teaching overseas students face-to-face if I go over there, or if someone else is delivering my material, I will still insist that it has to subscribe to research-based critical analysis, fundamentally. You can localize the data, you can localize the context, you can localize the case study. So use your local business. Or, I mean, even if I've got undergraduates or postgraduates who are doing their dissertation thesis, I will, I know that these students are going to go back, and I will actually question them when they come to ask me to be their supervisor, I will make sure with them, do they want to go back to Nigeria for their job? In which case, you want to do this topic, great, this is one of the topics I've set. Now, are you going to go with UK-based data, or are you going to actually use data from Lagos? Because that then gives them a dissertation thesis, which if they can get a sort of 75% or whatever, really good degree, then they can take that thesis with them to show future employers. And it will help their employability back home, whether it's in Nigeria or wherever. And so again, it's kind of context sensitivity, which is a thing. Critical thinking, mandatory. The case study you use, the data you use, you can localize that and gain maximum value for your future employment. That's my approach to that sort of thing.
Jose, any? To add?
Listen, my approach is slightly different. I think we have to train the teacher in many ways. If the teacher or the professor or the expert go to a particular country with a particular mindset, may not be as effective. So the idea of efficacy or effectiveness is extremely important, because from a business perspective, you are selling a product, and you're selling a product of very good quality, and you want that the product to be consistent in quality across cultures. And also, I'm working with international groups. I mean, imagine it's a master's in which I have 3 components, 3 different nationalities. I expect from my colleague to keep the same level of education similar, because we have a transnational group of people. But at the same time, the persons that I need to teach that has to be aware. If you begin imposing a particular approach, in any particular approach, Western, Eastern, Southern, Upper, we're not going to be as effective, given that each university has a reputation and each university wants to convey the message. We have to create individuals that are flexible enough. I don't want to use the approach of Trump and Hofstede, the typical approach, Dutch approach. But it's extremely important that you train the teacher. And sometimes our mistake is to send expert that is an expert in this little thing, and when we need an expert, much more ample. And you go there, and the image that they have, the effectiveness of the expert, it says, oh, that's very interesting, but it doesn't apply to us. Of course it's applied to us, but perhaps the convey of the message was not as effective. Why? Because he or she didn't do the homework, or perhaps the international experience of that expert is very limited. Because the people begin to discern the information, and the information is good quality in one paradigm of culture, but not another.
I want to now move on to assessments, because one of the things that we all have to write is assessments. And one of the things that I've noticed with my colleagues who do transnational education is sometimes there's a difference in the grades from different countries. And I'd like to, again, those who are on the floor, has anybody had experience of designing assessments which have to cross national boundaries? No? Can I ask to keep it quite short on it, because I want to come back to the lady in the front who obviously has to create assessments that go across boundaries, national boundaries, within your own country. So can I first start with experience across countries?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. Yes, we on occasion do have differences in grades. And that's when we moderate what we get back. Sometimes you get some very bizarre things. We had some problems with Israel, particularly where what I would have considered an A grade, or 75, 85% assignment, was marked at 45%, which is a bare pass. Because from my perspective, it had a fantastic critical analysis and application. From the Israeli marking perspective, it was no facts at all. All this whiffle-waffle about application and so on was kind of, no, it's not what we're wanting. And that was a problem. It took a long time to train. Now, I've just had a new program, new module go into Bangladesh, and the grades that they've awarded are almost identical. In terms of the academic side of the assignment marking, it was within an gnat's whisker, almost perfect with what I would have marked. The only bit that was a problem was that the 20% allocated for presentation, perfect formatting, citing references, hadn't been picked up at the formative review stage, and so most of the students lost about 10-15% compared with the UK. Now, we can fix that next term, because all of my lectures, I video all my lectures and share them with the colleagues over in Bangladesh. So they know exactly what I'm doing. The students can hear exactly what I'm saying in briefing the assignment to my students and the sort of reminders week by week that they need to work on. So that's another way that helps, I think, is to video your material or your lecturing, your workshops, so your partner institutions can use those directly with their students who are your students as well.
I remember the famous German adage that said, in the scale from 1 to 10, 10 is for God, 8 for the professor, and 6 is for the primus, the best in class. This concept is very interesting because it happened to me when I was much younger, working in France, in which, the scale in France is from 0 to 20 most of the time. So I put many 16s, and this says, it doesn't make any sense. Most of our students get a 12. So the concept of curving, the concept of great inflation in this particular moment in time is an American phenomenon. And great inflation could be very important many times for jobs, because some companies may look or may not look at that. There have been some studies in which they see that great inflation in the United States and perhaps in some other countries is creating an element. So that's why we curve. But try to explain the idea of curvature to a group of foreign students, it doesn't make any sense, especially when you have a same curriculum in 3 different countries. Because at the same, when you are working in masters, a tri-national masters, in which people from different nationality assign different elements, and they see it, and they try to understand the American perception, in my case, with the Brazilian and Spanish perception. So we have to be aware of that, in which the people are concerned, and universities, sometime in the US, are concerned about great inflation that is not in other places.
Would you like to comment on that? The grades that they expect.
Yeah, the grades expectation in high school, well, William is here. Okay. It's a battle. I've taught, like I say, I've taught in at least 6 different schools in Asia, and each one has got its own expectation. Each school has got its own culture. And as teachers, it's a very difficult thing to do. Do you want your job, or do you want to deliver what's appropriate? So there's always a fine line over there. But for me, I stick to what I believe in, what it should be. I personally do not believe in great inflation, and William here can attest to it. Okay. And that is also because our administrators are very supportive on that. We do not bow to the students.
It's really interesting because when you set your grades in that and your assessments, some students think when they get their marks back, that wasn't fair. They expect to get a first-class degree.
So I taught and studied in 3 countries. In Israel, completely different experience from what you described, but now I'll know that all my grades of 40 are probably because I just wasn't critical enough. I taught in Canada and in the US. And I agree that the scales differ, the expectations differ. Another thing that differs is how many points of assessments are you expected to have throughout the semester. In Israel, there's one test at the end, 100% of your grade. In the US, I'm expecting, and in Canada, even more so, to have like 6 different points of assessment. So by midterm, students know exactly if they want to drop the course or keep the course or do whatever, right? The one thing, though, that I see in common for all the countries and all my students from China and India and Africa and places is the expectation for proper feedback. So I think in that sense, the scales may be different, but the qualitative nature of the assessment, the expectation is the same everywhere. If you're dropping a point, you should explain why people lost it. And you should also be clear about what is expected from the students prior to the assignment. So these 2 things consistently I see with all the students that I teach, what are my expectations and how did they not meet them?
My final question to the panel, and Dennis, you don't get away with it. Oh, was somebody else?
I'm just going to make a quick comment. I've taught in Australia and France and a few other places, and the Australians are very, very supportive of rigorous grading. As a matter of fact, at the end of the semester, they had a meeting and you had to present your grades, and they was just as hard on you if they're too good. they were harder on you if they were too good versus too weak. On the other hand, I was doing a short course in France, and I was sort of counseled to match the B to 16 and sort of make it a little bit like what they might have expected in the U.S.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point about counselling the tutors who are delivering. And that's both sides, isn't it? And I think both Richard and Jose were picking up on that. My final question to, well, it's getting to be everybody, isn't it? Is that the experience of different hardware across different countries. Because one of the things that, I use a lot of software, and my students say to me, it doesn't work on my system. And then the other way around, I use state-of-the-art computers, and I'm sorry, some of the software isn't working on mine because the companies haven't caught up with the operating systems. So what's your experience of, this wide variation of hardware, software versions across countries?
Well, I've been in a number of situations where I've gone to another country to do a delivery, and I've got one version, they've got something else. And the difficulty on that is that generally it's, if you don't check ahead of time, you really do. I mean, it's a matter of before you go, you need to make sure, and you learn this right away, very, very quickly. You only have to make the mistake once of not checking to make sure that they've got the same version you do. Because after that, if you don't, I think start going downhill because you're telling them, now my version has, well, I did this in the Watson Analytics thing today, actually. It happened today, right? So the crowd is using the freemium version. I've got the professional version. And I got to tell you, up to the point that I got the professional version, I knew exactly what was on freemium, but it's changed so much. I don't know where the differences lie or what's on the freemium or whatever. So I actually went to over in Qatar to actually do a delivery on descriptive and predictive analytics. And I mean, other than the fact that my hardware didn't run over there, we couldn't connect it up to their equipment. It was a very, very simple thing. I just plugged it into the overhead projection and my screen went blue. Okay, not because I work for IBM, it just blue screened. And you unplug it, and then you boot everything up again, and you plug it in again, and it blue screened again. And you could feel disaster starting someplace along the line after the first one. And you see the other people who are with you helping to deliver this workshop that, they're scrambling to cover you while you're trying to figure out what happened. And the only way to get that going was to leave it plugged in and boot it up from scratch. But I mean, the one thing that's been mentioned a couple of times here today is the fact that the consistency right across of how the delivery is actually done. Recordings on how you've delivered it. I've done recordings also on some of the technical software on the metadata modeling side, and I've posted them. So if somebody else wants to deliver them, this is what I did, this is how I delivered it. The other thing is for the slide deck that I have, my notes, the one thing that drives me nuts is somebody passes me their slide deck and there's no notes in it. I have no idea how they delivered the actual bullet points that are on there. And I prefer a more visual presentation deck, or I prefer live. But the thing is that if it's a visual presentation deck, it's worse because there's no bullet points on it, right? So just learning from that, the one thing I've done for years now is every time I put a deck together, okay, and this is a bad way of thinking about it, but I think about what happens if I walk out the front door and I get hit by a bus. Somebody else has got to deliver this thing, right? So every single time I have something, I've put the notes right in there. There can be no mistake of what message I'm trying to get across. Yes, if there's any language barriers, there is going to be those situations where the interpretation of what I've written down may be wrong. Because the thing is in the end, you can only do so much. There's always going to be some kind of interpretation, but you want to make sure that the language, and it comes down to the language that is in the notes or the language that is on the slides or the language of how you've actually delivered something, even if it's recorded, that the language is consistent. It's in a way, you almost have to think about the fact that you got to go to the base of the language and make sure you deliver it in that way. And anybody, how many actually, and this is a good way of looking at it, how many people here have ever taken something and put it into Google Translate? Okay? Okay. So how close does it actually come, okay, to that language? Okay. How many people actually, how many people actually check what is translated before they pop it into an email and send it off, right? So I have cousins in Italy. At Christmas, I write my letters in Italian, okay? But you're darn right that what I do first is I take my English, I pop it into that translate, and I look at it, and you could see where the grammar, and I'm looking at it going, I know that's not right. I know it's not right, but it's as simple as that. So that even the language of what you put in, you really need to be careful. But even on the hardware, the software side, you better find out exactly what build, not only release, what build they have over there, so that right, it's the consistency thing right across that you have to be careful with.
Well, I've got very little time left of this session. And just to recap some of the things that we've looked at, if you're doing transnational education, you need to localize it and globalize it at the same time. Hey, that's difficult, isn't it?
Just one more little point.
Go on then.
Dennis was talking about sort of builds and software standards and so on. The other thing that's kind of interesting, I've tripped over many times, and this is actually quite significant if you're doing a research base where your students are, you're expecting your students to do lots of research to find journal articles and so on, is bandwidth. I have 100 megabits a second at home. We have 2 or 3 gigabits in and out at the university. So, you can get stuff instantaneously. When I was teaching back in about 8 years ago in Malawi, you were lucky if you got 45K. So downloading a 250K PDF was kind of seriously hard work. Botswana, when I was teaching there, the total international bandwidth in and out of Botswana was 15 meg. It's changed now because they now got some fiber, but you have to think about, if you're looking for, in this next half hour, your students are going to each find 5 interesting articles. This ain't going to work in some countries. So that's another localization issue you have to think about.
We're really running out of time. I was really hoping that we might have had some papers coming as well on this. But you can see hardware, software, localized, global, legal, political, cultural, assessments. And I predict that within the next 2 years, you will all have to write these courses. It will surprise me if you don't. But thank you very much, panel. It's been an interesting discussion, and very much to you, the audience, for participating as well. Thank you.
Thank you to you.